I never in my wildest imagination thought that we would have to do all the medical stuff and all the special needs stuff, nor did I ever thought that I would, outlive my son.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. My name is Risa and I'm your host. We are talking to real families about real stories here on The Real Family Eats, where we've got food for thought and thoughtful food. So let's eat. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm so glad that you are here. I am so very honored to be having our chat with our guest today. I have Jason, who has been kind enough to join us today. Hi, Jason. Thank you so much for being a guest here.
Hello, and thank you for having me on.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, Jason, for anybody who is listening who doesn't know who you are, can you please introduce yourself for us?
Yes, my name is Jason Tuttle. I'm a married father of 21 years this year, of two medically fragile children. Within about the first 5 years of my marriage, I had two kids that were both born with severe neurological delays, epilepsy, nonverbal, basically wheelchair bound, and then my son was born with a rare condition on top of everything else.
Wow.
So we started our marriage very quickly, being introduced into the special needs life. Um, we got, unfortunately, just 15 years with my son. As of about 3 years ago, he suddenly and unexpectedly passed away. And after a period of grieving, I decided, in a way to create a legacy for my son, to create my online platform called Letters to Zachary.
Wow. And I know you're going to tell us all about Letters to Zachary a little bit later on. And that's just a sneak preview. So thank you so much for being willing to come and get so vulnerable and honest with us, because I think that this is a topic that our society would probably much rather look over. And
Mhm.
when you're going through it as a parent, because it is things that people experience, it
Mhm.
can feel, gosh, so gosh darn isolating.
Mhm.
So thank you. Before we jump into the story, tell me, what recipe are you sharing with our parents today, and why did you choose this one?
Well, because of the aforementioned special needs life and having to have a lot of complicated things in my life that I had to know. Typically, when I cook, I'm a pretty simplistic cook. Uh, just because it just, at the end of the day, all I want to do is simple. And I looked online. I'm a fan of chili, and years ago I was a fan of very spicy hot chili, but due to some health conditions, I've had to scale back on the spiciness of a lot of things. And I came across Betsy's black bean chili. Honestly, I don't remember. Allrecipes.com is where I found it. Um,
Wonderful.
and I chose it because, one, it only had about 4 or 5 ingredients. It wasn't
Mhm.
too expensive, and I could kind of cater its spiciness based on what I or my kids wanted. My son was definitely like me in the sense that he loves spicy food, and that's another reason why I chose it.
Yeah, I love that. And I love you mentioned kind of that simplistic. I feel like so many parents that I've heard of, I know myself, that sometimes you don't have the capacity to do, a five-course meal. And so you do need something that's going to be hearty and just simple that we can throw together, which is why I love this. We're a big chili fan household as well. We haven't quite tried this one. I feel like everybody has their own take on chilies, and so I'm excited to try this one today. So, with that in mind, can you give us the overview of the steps, and then I'll get cooking while we chat.
Okie dokie. Typically when I cook it, I double it up because I love chili and I'll eat it for days on end. So
Okay.
all of the things that I'm giving people, I typically do twice as much just because I like to make more to have for later. And I mean, I'll eat it cold, hot, you name it. But the ingredients are basically a pound of ground round. I've used that. I've used regular hamburger. I've used several different, and they're all pretty good with it. Um,
Okay.
two 15-ounce cans of black beans. It says no salt, but I've done either or, and they're both good. 8-ounce cans of no salt tomato sauce. A jar of salsa. I typically do mild in there because if I adjust the spiciness of it, I do it more in the powder side of it versus the salsa side of it. And
Okay.
then a tablespoon of chili seasoning. Um, and basically, the longest part for me is just browning the hamburger meat that I'm using. And then once I
Hmm.
get that done, it's literally you put it in a big stock pot and you dump literally everything in and you let it simmer for about 30 minutes. About the only thing that you have to do outside of dumping it in is one of the cans of black beans it wants the liquid in there, and one of it wants it drained out of, just so it's not so soupy in the end.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, I can do that. And thankfully I've got my brown meat already kind of cooked. So we're just at the, like you said, throw it in and let it simmer. So I'm excited to do that today. So while I do that and while I get going,
Mm.
um, I would love to kind of start at that beginning. I heard you mention and giving us a little bit of background for you that your introduction, your and your spouse's introduction into parenthood was kind of really quick in the sense of jumping to from just difficulty of becoming a parent and that life
Mhm.
transition to kind of expert level in the
Yep.
sense that you're now dealing with children with fragile medical needs,
Yep.
it sounds like. And so I would love to start if you could share with me and anyone who's listening what that was like, even just at the beginning and kind of getting those diagnoses as new parents, what that was like for you folks.
Um, in my blunt fashion, as I always am, it was like getting hit by a Mack truck as you're standing on the interstate, is what it was, at least in the beginning, specifically for the rare condition. I won't get into a long drawn out version, but the basic story leading up to all that was my wife and I got married. We were mid to late 20s when we got married. We wanted to have several kids at that point before we found out about my son's, all of his issues. And we had no reason to believe that there were going to be any issues. We were perfectly fine up until the week 20 appointment, which is that appointment where you find out the sex of the child. And we got in there, and just to tell you the kind of the regionally, culturally different views on things, my wife being from the Northeast and a cradle Catholic did not want, for any reason, wanted to know the sex of the child. It was the last great surprise. She didn't want to know. I'm not born and raised in the South, but I've lived in the South most of my life. I wanted to know the sex of the child. And plus, I was doing the nursery and all that. And so I kind of want to cater to whatever we were having at that point. My family even actually was big into ancestry in that time. My father went back 10 generations in our family, and we asked about 5 generations of my wife's family, and there were no medical issues, no medical issue that wasn't, say, self-induced, like an alcoholism or something like that in the families.
Yeah.
So we get into the week 20 appointment, and we're going back and forth, and the ultrasound tech goes, I'm at the point of finding out the sex of the child. Do you want to know? And my wife and I playfully go back and forth, and before we can finish, she goes, well, I've found an issue and I need to know. So at that point, we go, well, what's the sex of our child? They said, you're having a boy. Great. And I looked at her and said, can you tell me what the issue is?
Hmm.
And she looks at me and she said, well, that's more of a doctor relayed message. And I said, okay, I understand. And I said, well, can you answer this? Why did you need to know the sex of the child? And she said, well, if it's what I think I'm seeing, she said it's rare in boys, but even rarer in girls. And that's all we knew.
Wow.
So the next step was they referred us to a perinatologist, which is kind of a high risk OBGYN. And we saw him from week 20 to week 38. And week 38 was the week that my wife had a C-section. We went through that process. He was wrapped up. We literally saw him 30 seconds and they whisked him away to the NICU in that hospital. Uh,
Wow.
my wife had to go to recovery, and then I went up there, and it wasn't until the moment I walked in that NICU where he goes, "By the way, your son was born with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome." And at the time he was born, it was 1 in 40,000 births.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay, so for anybody who doesn't know what that is, can you maybe just give us a little bit of a summary of what is that? What are some of the symptoms?
So it's a rare condition because they know characteristics about it, but they don't know the official like start point to it. They know it's a GI issue. They know
Okay.
it's there's kidney issues, which meaning my son was only born with one kidney. The one kidney he did have did sustain some damage in utero, and so what that meant was when he was born, the more he got to an adult, did he have enough good kidney to sustain normal function?
Yeah.
So there's kidney issues there. He was born with an abnormally large bladder that needed to be given a catheter every 4 hours, at least the first 5 years of his life.
Wow.
That's a part of Eagle-Barrett syndrome. And if so, basically, what it meant was, whereas you and I get that sensation that we've got to go, he didn't necessarily get that. And what that also meant was if I didn't cath him, he was susceptible to urinary tract infections. And for those that don't know, the reason why you get those infections is because there's sediment in that fluid, and it's that sediment that irritates and causes the infection. And
Okay.
so that's why you have to void or drain your bladder to get it out so it doesn't happen.
Hmm.
So it's kidney issues, an abnormally large bladder that has to be drained. The main reason why it's called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, and it's also more affectionately known as prune belly, is because my son was born without any core abdominal muscle. He had none. So like I
Wow.
could lay him on the floor, and the only thing between his organs and the outside world was the skin and the fascia that hold the skin together. So I could literally lay him on the floor, and from the outside I could touch his small intestine, his large intestine, his bladder, his stomach, he literally was like one of those plastic like biology dummies you see in high school that sit and stand. I could literally touch all that in that section from the
Wow.
outside. And so that is all Eagle-Barrett syndrome.
Hmm.
But one of the reasons why he was medically fragile is because a secondary issue of it was because he didn't have that core muscle there, whereas you and I can, when we get a pneumonia or a flu, we can cough the crud out.
Hmm.
And the reason why is because we have that muscle there, we can create pressure on that muscle like a foundation, and it pushes off that muscle to force it out. Well, because he didn't have that muscle, he didn't have that much force, and so if I didn't catch it early enough, ultimately we were in the hospital.
Yeah. Wow. I imagine, especially as this being your first child, your introduction into parenthood, that's got to be scary.
Yes, it's a very steep, almost straight up learning curve.
Yeah.
Especially the first I typically tell people usually about until year 6. And the reason why I say that is because what they don't tell you about a lot of these medical issues, they tell you about the primary stuff, but they don't tell you about the secondary issues that happen because of the medical issue. Like typically in Eagle-Barrett syndrome kids, you don't necessarily have a lot of respiratory issues, but my son did. And for the first 5 years of his life, we were literally in and out of the hospital every 6 months in the ICU every time we went.
Wow. Yeah. And so I'm curious if you'd be willing to share, did that impact just even your own well-being, your own kind of mental wellness and stability. I mean, can you talk to us a little bit about what was going on for you in those moments?
Yes, it affected it vastly. And so what I know now because of events that have happened 3 years ago, what I realized now from back then was I was grieving at that point, not realizing I was, meaning I was grieving the life I thought we were going to have versus the life that we were given.
Yeah.
And as a subsequent issue from that, I held on to a lot of anger for a very long time. Now, it was more of an internal anger. It wasn't necessarily directed at anybody, but it did
Okay.
come out with, either snappy comments or, kind of quick wit stuff or snarky stuff. I mean, it would come out, but it wasn't like I was looking at my wife and yelling at her by any stretch of the imagination. It was just something I was holding on to that was coming out in its own way. The other way that it affected me was since the day my son was born, if I don't have medicinal help, I can't sleep
Hmm.
because there were several occasions throughout the years that I literally woke up, heard him in his monitor, came into his room, and I'm in his room. I had to get him up, get him dressed, and race to the hospital in the middle of the night. And
Wow.
so from that time forward, so even to this day, I take a medication to help me sleep.
Hmm. And so, I mean, already, you're maybe traditional
Mhm.
newborn kind of young child, those are sleepless nights already, just by nature. Now we're adding, like you said, that layer of it's almost like a necessity to, it sounds like, to be on high alert.
Mhm.
So I can absolutely appreciate, like you said, that it's really impacted even just the sleep portion if we just want to talk about that.
Mhm. Sure, certainly. Now, as a caveat to it, both of my kids were excellent sleepers. They
Hmm.
slept through the night from day one.
Wow.
I have worked in education, so you can imagine I worked on the elementary level, worked with mostly women, and I used to get so much flack for that. That's so unfair that you're, and
I bet.
I said, it may be, but I said, for everything else I've been given in life, God had to give me
Hmm.
something or I would have lost my mind a long time ago. And sleep is the one thing he gave me.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I was always in Goma. And to this day, even with just his sister and just life, I'm still always in go mode. I don't shut down.
Wow. That's got to be exhausting.
It is, especially on those stretches where I don't sleep well. Uh,
Hmm.
Currently, I'm kind of a couple of days into another stretch where I haven't been sleeping well. I know last year I did a stretch of 3 weeks where I was up and down all night, or I was sleeping 4 hours a night, or I wasn't getting rest.
Yeah. So how do you move through that to, be able to have some sort of capacity to still, because when we as parents, when we don't sleep, it doesn't mean that our job as parents just we get to take, time out. We don't
Yeah.
have time off in that way. So how do you manage that? How do you work through something like that and still be able to kind of do the day-to-day get up and take care of them?
I it's going to sound really simplistic, but I essentially have just forced myself to muscle through it.
Hmm.
Whereas most people might have, a second or third win, I would get to my seventh and eighth wins because
Wow.
I mean, I had to. I had no other choice other than just to do it. I mean,
Hmm.
it was just my way of life.
Yeah. Were you able to find, especially in the earlier years, any forms of support or resources that helped alleviate even in the slightest some of the pain and the stressors and the grief that you were having to work through?
Um, yes and no. Knowing my personality type. I'm still going to stress about. I mean, I could have everything sitting at my door and I'm still going to stress about it. It's
Hmm.
just it's just the I have accepted it's the nature of me. Uh I just outside of dealing with my kids' issue, I have dealt with depression for 20 plus years, anxiety, and I was just recently diagnosed ADHD. And
Okay.
when my counselor diagnosed it to me, I literally looked at her and I said to her, well, that explains a lot over the last 40 something years.
Wow.
And so on top of, I had to kind of push my issue to the side when I had a moment to be able to deal with my kids and just everything going on with them. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I just did what I had to do.
Hmm. Did you find that the stressors that you were dealing with as a family, was that exacerbating some of the depression and anxiety that you already kind of had been working through, it sounds like, at this period of time, if I'm hearing you correctly?
Um, no, I don't remember that it did, honestly, but
Okay.
I know that I didn't realize in the moment, and honestly, I fully admit the actions that I did. Um, my anger did come out. It wasn't towards the kids or my wife, but it was affecting our marriage. Um, and there were moments where, both my wife and I are very blunt, as we grew up. And there were moments where in response to me, kind of laid into me, and I respectfully took it because I mean, honestly, that was the right thing to do. Looking back of how I acted, because I didn't know how to handle the immense amount of stress, and
Yeah.
it got to a point to where even I went, enough of this garbage. I need to see someone because I've got to get past this. And I saw a counselor once a week, every week for a year, and I finally got through a lot of the garbage I was dealing with that kind of helped things along.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, it did come out. And then the other thing was, it never got out of hand by any stretch of the imagination, but I found myself in the evenings when but my kids were asleep, where I was starting to drink to take the edge off because there
Hmm.
was just so much stress and there was so much at times life-saving things I had to do in a moment's notice that I had to have something that just dull things for, if anything, a short period.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but again, like I said, and that never got out of hand. And it wasn't a long period of time, but I finally got to the point where it's just like I've just got to stop doing this.
Hmm. And I imagine that in itself of reaching out and kind of coming to that awareness of something's got to change, and being able to, like you said, go to a counselor and say, hey, there's a lot of stressors here,
Hmm.
um, that that are impacting, and I'd like some ways to be able to help alleviate them, because I think, again, and this is a soapbox for another day, that we don't get taught some of
Hmm.
these emotion regulation, stress management, how to be able to, like you said, when we're feeling overwhelmed, be able to actually work through that without feeling like I don't know anything else but to numb it. So here I've got to find some way to numb it because it's just too much.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I mean, I went through a couple of vices, if you will. Never got into drugs or anything like that. That just never was my thing. But I drank for a little while. I smoked cigars for a while. I mean, I went from kind of one thing to the next just to be able to get through those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I appreciate you mentioning even things like cigars, that for you, it sounds like they were coming, as something to kind of take the edge off or to
Mhm.
help relieve, because I think sometimes we forget about those things and we
Hmm.
go, smoking a cigarette or smoking a cigar or even having a drink of alcohol that, oh, it's not, that's not what it's for.
Hmm.
But absolutely, when we're finding kind of ourselves reaching, because we are just looking to take the edge off, that
Hmm.
it could mean that it's potentially something for us to look into of maybe it is, like you said, kind of those stressors that we just don't know any other outlet to be able
Hmm.
to kind of deal with it.
Hmm.
Yeah. Would you be willing? You mentioned something, and I wanted to take a moment, if we could, to circle back to it.
Okay.
You mentioned grieving the life I thought I would have, or
Hmm.
the parenting piece of it. And I've heard that before, and I would love for you to say a little bit more about that grieving, because I think sometimes just as a whole we miss that part and we maybe don't give it space or time.
Well, all of us, when if we decide that we want to have a family, you've got this mental picture of what you think your family life is going to be like. I mean, you could go back to the classic example of the nuclear family of a husband, a wife, three kids, a dog, the fence, that kind of thing. And, I didn't necessarily have that picture, but I never in my wildest imagination thought that we would have to do all the medical stuff and all the special needs stuff, nor did I ever thought that I would, outlive my son.
Mm.
And, some of the things throughout there, like for example, I can run my mouth. I mean, I'm a talker. I'm like my father. I could talk to a wall if I really needed to. I just that's just how I am. And then I had a son who was born that never talked because he was
Mm.
nonverbal. I had a son that all I ever wanted to hear from him was just him saying "Dad" once, and he never his entire life said it.
Wow.
My degree's in physical education. I'm very sports minded. And not that I would have pushed him in it, but should he have wanted to go into sports, then we could have had that bonding moment and he had special needs where he probably would have never played sports. And
Hmm.
so that was for me, that was kind of the grieving. And then for my wife, it was just all the normal things people get excited about, your child's born and then they roll over and then they start crawling, they start walking. We didn't necessarily have those.
Yeah.
Or, not that anybody wants the terrible twos, but we didn't necessarily have that. Or some of the things that everybody else had, we weren't like anybody else around us. And so
Hmm.
all of those things were really tough pills to swallow for us.
Yeah, I imagine so. And like you said, that some of these things that maybe others would take for granted,
Hmm.
and then not having that, and the grief that comes with, like you
Hmm.
said, just rolling over,
Yeah.
right? And you see that all the time. I can't tell you how many countless social media posts I've seen of people filming those things and, oh, look at
Yep.
this milestone, and then to not be able to experience that in your own parenting journey, that
Hmm.
that it does come with a grief that maybe doesn't get talked about.
Hmm.
Yeah. So, okay, so fast forward, and then your second child was born, and you said, if I heard you correctly, your second
Hmm.
child also having fragile medical needs. Did I hear you correctly?
She did.
Okay.
My son had the rare condition, but both of my kids had identical neurological delays, which were severe. Both had epilepsy. In fact, of the six different kinds of seizures, I've seen four of them in my house. Uh,
Wow.
both of them were nonverbal. Both of them could walk with assistance, but they couldn't walk on their own, so they were basically wheelchair bound.
Mm,
Now, granted, if you put them both on the floor, they could army crawl like nobody's business, but like to stand up and walk,
hmm.
no. My son never walked on his own. My daughter has kind of stood on her own for brief moments, but walked, no. And
Yeah.
so that's one thing, like we've done genetics for 10 years now, and they still can't figure out why. when there's been nobody with medical needs in our family like this. We had two born 2 years apart, almost to the day, almost identical to each other. They still can't
Wow.
figure it out.
Yeah, and I imagine that surprise, like you said, where there's not a preparation, oh, this ABC runs in our family,
Mhm.
that that just kind of piles on to this, like, how do you prepare for something like that?
I mean, you don't, and it's kind of along the ideology of people that say, one of them wants to stay at home, and the only way you can't prepare for it, you just have to do it. Because
Mm,
if you prepare for it, you'll never be ready for it.
yeah,
And getting introduced in the special needs world is similar. I mean, most of us will never see it coming, but when it happens, you got to play the cards that you're dealt and do the best you can with them.
yeah. Was that when you got the news about your second child? Can you talk a little bit about that experience and kind of you're already dealing with your first child and now the second child and getting, this information as well. What's going
Uh,
on for you? What's that like?
it hit hard. I'll never forget it. We had in Georgia here, we have a babies program called Georgia Babies Can't Wait.
Okay.
And it's kind of an early intervention service for kids that to help them along with their normal steps and goals up until it's a year or 5 years. It's something like that. And one day we had an occupational therapist that was coming in for my son, and she came in, she had an intern with her, and she said, "Do you mind if my intern does what they call the Peabody Skills Assessment Test on your daughter?" And I went, "Sure, if I had to pay for that out of pocket, I know what that test cost." I said, "So practice away."
Yeah.
And she did it. And I'll never forget it. She looks at me and she goes, "In my professional opinion, that your daughter is delayed." And now this is the first that's ever been mentioned from anybody. And I admit my response wasn't the best response, and I since have apologized to them. But I literally looked at her. I went, "Pack up your S and get out of my house."
Wow.
That cold hearted.
Yeah.
And because my brain could not handle it. When I heard
Hmm.
that, my brain just shut down because I was just like, the wheels are starting to turn for her on top of my son. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to handle this.
Yeah.
And we went to our pediatrician, and she has a special needs daughter, and it was finally through our pediatrician that said, "I tend to agree with you. You may want to have her start seeing a neurologist."
Wow. Wow. And like you said, I can only imagine I would probably be in a similar state. And even to this day, and I've been a therapist for many, many years, that your brain, like you said, would just shut down of like, I I don't have anything else for you right now
Yeah.
because the house is on fire
Yeah.
and there's no water to put it out.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Wow. And so then from that, like you mentioned, I know, kind of forwarding ahead,
Hmm.
then you had the passing of your son. And so I
Yes.
would love to kind of, if you're okay with it, go into
Sure.
kind of then that experience on top of everything else.
Okay. So up until about year six, it was a steep uphill learning curve. And after about year six, we really started leveling off at that point. We had a
Okay.
few hospital stays. We did have a major surgery to kind of give my son some reconstruction in his midsection, and that really helped on the hospital stays. Once he had that surgery, it almost went down to none. The only other hospital stay he had after that was about 5 months before he actually passed. He had a spinal fusion surgery because he had bad scoliosis.
Okay.
So the things that I was a stay-at-home parent during this whole time, and with all of his hospital stays, like I said, I'm in his room, and on one of the other walls, I used to have a shelving unit, and I had six respiratory related machinery The moment I heard a cough that would come out of him, I would immediately go into my medical protocol, and I would go from a machine A to machine B to D to E to F, all the way down the line to kind of get the crud loose, get it suctioned up, get it into his throat, get it out of his throat and out of his body is what I had to do. And then at the end, I had to use a nebulizer, which every parent knows what a nebulizer is, for breathing treatments to help keep it at bay. And if that
Yeah.
didn't work, I would end up in the hospital. So all of my medical knowledge was in kind of the respiratory, urological end of things, not so much outside of that. And I could get really detailed in it, but kind of the less detailed version of it is 3 days before he came home, that evening yeah, he threw up a little bit while we were brushing his teeth. We kind of thought that maybe we hit his like gag reflex and something just came
Okay.
up
Yeah.
and didn't think much about it. Uh, we put him to bed and, he's always been a great sleeper. Well, that night, see that if it was Wednesday night, he kind of threw up. We put him to bed that night and he was literally up and down all night,
Mm.
and which was unusual for him. So that next day, which was Thursday, I texted his teacher, said, "Hey, I'm keeping him home. He's sick. I don't know what he's got. I don't want to spread it to his special education room. I'm gonna keep him home." Great. Sent my daughter off to school, and then that day, I sat him in his favorite chair, and I kept telling him all day, "Buddy, you can take a nap. You've got to be exhausted. You've been up for, at that point, 20 hours or something like that, something ridiculous."
Wow.
And he wouldn't go to sleep. He wouldn't drink or eat a whole lot, but that didn't strike me as anything because it was the first day. And I looked at my wife and I said, "Well, if he's refusing tomorrow," I said, "that's going to catch my attention." I said, "I'm okay with one day." I said,
Mm.
"Because who wants to eat or drink when you're feeling like garbage?"
Yeah.
And I said, "If he's not doing it tomorrow," I said, "that's going to catch my attention." So he refused to take a nap. He refused to do anything like that. And then that evening, I put him to bed, and he immediately gets quiet. I just looked at my wife and said, "He's got to be exhausted at this point. He's been up for 40 hours. He's just got to be. He's probably just passed out because he's just so exhausted."
Hmm.
The next morning we got up. It was just a gut call. I told my wife, I said, "I'm going to keep him home again. It's Friday morning." I said, "If worst comes to worst, I've got the weekend. We'll give him more time to recover. We'll go back on Monday." Great. Told his teacher, sent my daughter off to school. Typically, when I go in to get him up on a weekend, he would bounce and clap and be excited to see everybody. And I walked into his room and his eyes were open, and I wouldn't say he was lethargic, but he looked at me, but the look was kind of he looked through me versus looking at me.
Mm.
And I came over to the side of his bed and I noticed out of the right side of his mouth, he had a dark green streak of fluid that was coming out of his mouth. And I look at my wife and I go, "The only thing that's dark green in the body is bile, and why is it coming out of his mouth?"
Yeah.
So I, so I get him up and he's floppy and like he can't hold himself up, and that doesn't strike me because I had a couple of times before when he went for a respiratory stay, he was that way, and I thought, well, I said he looks like he's getting sicker. I need to just make some decisions. So I
Hmm.
take him out into the living room and I go through my medical protocol, and nothing's at his sword, anything like that. And because of his prune belly, typically he's either spongy or really pliable in that section. And I go to feel it, and he is like cinder block wall, rock hard,
Wow.
right where his like intestines would be. And I go, "This is not right." I said, "Something's wrong." And in that moment, in my brain, time starts slowing down. I go, "What am I going to do? What's my next steps? How am I going to do that?" And I look at my wife and I go, "I'm going to get him dressed. I'm taking him to Children's Hospital. Something's not right." It was honestly a gut call. Get him dressed, get him in the van, and I do like 90 miles an hour up to the local Children's Hospital because I don't know what's going on. I don't know how
Yeah.
severe it is. I get in there, I park in the parking deck, and I get his chair out, and I go to lift him out of the van, and he's very floppy at this point, and this catches my attention. So I get him in his chair, I get up to like at the front desk of the ER, and I skip the line to go to the nurse. And the security guard comes over to me as if to say, "You need to get in line." And I look at him without skipping a beat. I went, "I don't think he's breathing. I need help immediately." And the nurse hears me. She comes over to me. She looks at him. Now, understand, I've been in this hospital 100 times. And she goes, "Follow me." And we go at a full run as fast as we can go back into the ER to a trauma room. We get in there, and because I've been in the hospital so much, I unbuckle him from his chair. I put him on the gurney, and I instinctively back away and hope that they'll let me stay in there because he's nonverbal. He can't talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so, luckily for me, there's a trauma room next to this one, and the doors are open, and I back off in there to where I can see things, but they have room to do their thing.
Yeah.
Well, a group of like 30 people come in there and they just like ants on an ant hill. They cut off his clothes. They immediately intubate him, which puts the tube down to get air in his lungs. And the first thing that they do that catches my attention, this guy walks over to his knee and like a drill, like drills a port into him just immediately.
Wow.
And it's literally going into his knee like the bone.
Yeah.
And my son doesn't even flinch. And so I later asked, I said, "What did you do right there?" And he said, "Typically when people come in like this, when we don't know what's going on," he said, it's a way to get antibiotics into him very quickly." And I said, "Okay, well, they gave him no pain meds." And a normal person, if you drilled into a bone, they would have come off the table. I mean, like
Yeah.
it would have been so excruciating, like it would have been so excruciatingly painful, like you would have probably passed out because you couldn't have mentally taken it.
Mm-hmm.
So they do that, and we're there about 2 minutes, and they immediately start chest compressions on him. And I'm seeing this, and I'm recognizing it, but it's just not registering in my brain the severity of what's going on. Head ER doc comes over to me and she goes, "Down to the minute, how long has he been this way?" And I said, "Plus or minus like 2 minutes, he's been this way for this long." Goes off, barks orders. She comes back to me and she goes, "Explain to me the scenario as to why you've come in." I tell her, and then she goes back and barks orders. Well, they've been doing chest compressions at this point for about 3 minutes ish, and
Okay.
I see him get the paddles out. They put him on him, and I hear him yell clear. And just like a medical drama, it shocks him, and he raises off the table.
Wow.
And because of his respiratory issues, I'm very familiar with that shows the pulse, the heart rate, the oxygen, all that on it. And they shock him, and it goes boop and goes right back to what it's doing. And in that moment, I go, he's not coming back. And it's still I don't get emotional at this point. I just in my brain I go, he's not coming back. Well, they work for 45 continuous minutes trying to save his life. And
Wow.
they get to that point. The head ER doc comes over to me and she said, "I could shock him again, but unfortunately, I think the result's going to be the same." And I said, "Do what's medically necessary or professional." I said, "This is out of my wheelhouse." They do it, nothing changes, and she pronounces them. As you can imagine, I go off, I have a moment, and it's literally like 20 seconds. I have a moment. And I immediately then call my wife. My wife at this moment, who's working from home, is thinking, "I'm going up to the hospital. He's getting admitted. We're going to be there 7 to 10 days as we normally are. I'm going to come home." I
Yeah.
have to tell my wife that my son's dead on a table. And I will never forget the sound she made when I told her that. She had her moment. She regained her composure. I said, "Message your boss, leave work, call your
Mm-hmm.
parents, have them drive up here. You're not in a state to drive. You need to be up here." And I left it at that. She said, "Okay." And that's what she did. I then called my mother. I'll never forget her response and what she said. Now, later on down the road, she goes, "How soon after he had passed did you call me?" I said, "About 10 minutes." And she goes, "You were eerily calm, being only 10 minutes after your son had passed away." She said, "You were almost robotic." And I said, "Well, in that moment, I had to be because I had to tell Jennifer, tell you, get information." And I said, if I'd have been a quote unquote blubbering idiot in that point, I said, I wouldn't have been able to talk to y'all. So, and I did that, and then the care team came in and all that kind of stuff, and she asked if she could help, and I pointed at my son and I said, "This is going to sound cold and callous, and I really don't mean it to be." I said, "But I need information right now. That's what's going to help me in this moment." She goes, "Okay, what do you need to know?" And I literally rapid fired back to back like 20 questions. I mean, as fast as I could get them out of my mouth. And
Yeah.
she takes a step back and then she goes, "Well, let me answer the first one." She answers all of them. But to kind of end this section, we were there, and people always ask me about that day, what was the hardest thing outside of him actually passing? I said, there were two things that I'll never forget. I said, as I was sitting there waiting on his mother to come up, I said, it surprised me how cold he got, how fast he got that way. Like
Hmm.
he had just been pronounced, it may have been 15 minutes. And I went to go like rub his hair out of his face, and he was ice cold. And
Wow.
that shocked me. And then the other thing was when we finally decided to leave, and we were going to go to a funeral home, that kind of thing. I had to take all of his cut off clothes, put him on his empty wheelchair, and wheel it through that hospital. Put it
Hmm.
in our van, and we're 60 miles from this hospital. We had to drive 60 miles home in
Wow.
literal dead silence.
Yeah.
Like we were just in shock to get home. And I told people, I said, those were the two hardest things I've ever had to do.
Wow. And gosh, I am so sorry that just to kind of hear you tell that and to be in the room and like you said, kind of see all of this and I imagine just the helplessness in that moment
Um,
as they're caring.
I didn't feel helpless in that moment because the thought in my brain was the people that are working, these are the best people possible
Hmm.
if they were to save him when I realized he wasn't coming back to be working on him because I didn't have this kind of knowledge. And if it
Yeah.
would have been, I mean, if I'd have called an ambulance, sure, EMTs have a lot of medical knowledge, but do they have it to the point of like a hospital ER?
Hmm.
That I don't know. And even after the fact, when we walked out, the head ER doc came out of like her little cubby that was right where she was. And I stopped and I point blank looked at her and I said, "Look, I am by no means upset at any of y'all." I said, "Y'all did the best y'all could." I said, "Yes, this sucks. I'm going to have my moments later." I said, "Just because I'm in shock at this point, to be honest with you." I said, "But thank you for all that y'all did. And medical dramas do not do y'all justice." And I
Hmm.
said, "I appreciate everything y'all did." And I mean, I walked off. I get they get affected by this too. They're human just as much. I just wanted her to know, look, y'all did everything y'all can. I never thought y'all would work for 45 continuous minutes. Now, I knew they weren't going to do 5 or 10, but to work for almost an hour continuously to try to
Yeah.
save him, that just blew my mind.
Wow. How do you, because I heard you mention at that point, so you're feeling the shock, which I think
Mm.
makes so much sense. And you mentioned there, I'll have my moment later. How do you move through that and move forward from that?
Um, I will say the first moment I had was, like I said, I'm in his room. We got into the house. You can't see it here, but kind of where the curtain is in my screen, if you go kind of to the other side of that, there's a corner in this room. I wheeled his wheelchair in with all of his cut off clothes on it, and it has not left that spot in 3 years. And when I came in here, I did that, and I kind of stood by his bed and just kind of stared at it, and it was just like out of the blue, the dam broke, and
Wow.
it hit me like a Mack truck, and I had
Hmm.
a moment for a while. We knew that we had to go over to my folks' house because like my whole family was over there, and my brothers and I were cordial with each other, and it's not like we don't like each other. It's just we typically see each other on family functions, that kind of like, are we buddy buddy where we hang out on the weekends? No. But,
Hmm.
family functions, we're together, all that. I walk into my parents' house, and I've never been this way around my eldest brother, but I saw him and I walked in my parents' room and like my knees buckled and like uncontrollably. I don't know. I've never been that way around. I don't know what it was about that moment where I was that way. And he grabbed me and gave me a hug as I was having a moment. And I went into the living room and everybody wanted to know what was going on. So I was trying to tell them, but I'd get 4 or 5 words out, and then that like trembling feeling started, and then I'd get
Hmm.
4 or 5 words out. I mean, that was the longest conversation I think I've ever had. And so that was kind of how I dealt with it. And there was just a lot of anger, a lot of emotion. There was a lot of times I wanted to go out in the garage and punch a hole through the drywall kind of scenarios, those kind of things. And then I'm one of those people in situations that are odd or off the wall or similar to this. I have a weird sense of humor, and so a lot of my weird sense of humor was coming out when I wasn't having emotional moments, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. So that's kind of how I dealt with it.
Hmm. How did you get from that to the mission of Letters to Zachary? Can you tell us a little bit about where that was born from?
Sure. So I'm a proponent of counseling and therapy. I always have been. Um, right after my son, literally 2 weeks before my son had passed, I'd literally finished up what I felt like was a season of therapy. I called her, I
Okay.
told her, and I said, if I should need you again, I'll get on your waiting list, that kind of thing, and I'll get back to seeing you. And so my son had passed, and I called her up and I said, hey, I need an emergency session. I really don't want to talk about it over the phone. If you can squeeze me in anywhere, I promise you, you will understand when we meet. And luckily, she was able to get me in. And at that point, I was going once a week for a very long while, and probably about 2 months into it, I want to say we were talking, and she goes, "Have you ever thought about journaling?" And the irony of my next statement, based on the response I've gotten since then, is I said, I don't know if journaling's my thing. I don't know how great of a writer I am, is my exact words. And she goes,
Wow.
well, she said, you don't have to do it right now. She said it's more of a mindfulness activity to get it off of you. She said you don't have to share it with anybody. If you want to, you can. She said, you can physically write it out and shred it or burn it or whatever you want to do with it. It's more to get it off of you than anything. And I said, okay. Well, I put that on the mental back burner for probably 9 months after that point. I fought
Wow.
it. I resisted. I didn't want to do it. And
Hmm.
then one day I got on Facebook and I was watching like a Facebook reel or a video, something, and I don't even remember what it was about. And something in one of those videos struck a chord with me that related to my son. And I was sitting on the couch and I just lost it, like
Hmm.
bawling, crying, just ugly crying, you name it. And it was in that moment that I opened up a Word document and in proper Oxford English style, because that's how my ADHD brain works.
Yeah.
I wrote it, the date, Dear Zachary, and I just verbally vomited on a page. And like I was raw to the sense of if I felt like I needed to write an F bomb because that's what I was feeling, that's what I wrote. And
Hmm.
I did that several times a day for weeks. And essentially, what had happened was I got to know this female admin of one of the groups I was in. And one day I said, hey, do you mind if I post one of my journal entries? And before I could literally finish it, she goes, yes, we would love for you to. We rarely, if ever, get men in here willing to open up in this group. And I said, okay. And I went to go share it. And in my brain, I go, no matter how noble this may be, is it still the internet? Am I going to be able to handle negative comments should I get them? Because at
Yeah.
that point in time, my brain probably wasn't in the best space. And I went, oh, well, I'll do it anyway.
Wow.
And that evening, I got a massively positive response.
Hmm.
The best comment I ever got was I had this one woman in the group goes, we've never met, our paths have never crossed, we've never talked, I've never told anybody anything deep down to how I feel about the loss of my child. And she goes, your letter, I relate to it. It hits word for word, the entire letter. And she goes,
Wow.
this speaks to me. And I said, well, I appreciate that it resonates to you and it's inspired by my son. And I kept doing these letters for weeks. And when you start to get to a point where people recognize that they think that you're good at something, they start giving you the suggestions. Podcasting, writing a book, and all of those, I went, I don't know if I'm in the brain space for it. And it was somebody said, well, have you ever thought about doing a Facebook page? And I went, well, what is that? And they told me, and they said, you're not creating more material. You're basically copying, pasting at this point until you run through it. And she said, and they said, you can create a following that way and go from there. And so that's kind of what I did. And that typically is where I post everything first because that's where everything started.
Hmm.
But like in the premise of it, I started reaching out to people in the grief community and started getting pointers of what worked for them and whatnot. Because like I told them, I said, I think I've got something here and I want to grow it. And so because of those pointers, I really started to grow for what I was doing. And so that's basically how Letters to Zachary came out. Um, I write letters, I write prose, I do memes, I do short videos, I do uh, GIFs or GIFs. I can never pronounce that right. I do anything grief related. Um, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram, I'm even on TikTok, and I never thought I'd be on TikTok. Um, and I've grown to like it just because in my ADHD brain,
Hmm.
because I always randomly come up with thoughts, especially related to grief. I can go on there, record a 2 minute video about a thought and grief and get people to respond on it. And so that's why I like TikTok so much, is
Yeah.
because it works with just how my brain operates. But I mean, I've even created a professional website. So I mean, I've only been doing this now 17 months.
Oh, wow.
I've
Okay.
been doing, and so I've done that. I'm also published. I have gotten published. It's not a book, it's actually a coloring book.
Okay. Well, I think that's a perfect segue into our shameless plug section. For anybody who is looking for some of these resources, wanting to connect with you,
Mm.
please plug away. Tell us how we can find all of these things that you're offering.
Sure. For those that are interested, that want to get connected with me, you can go to letterstozachary.com, and Zachary is spelled Zachary. I know some people spell it Ey. And yeah, I've got icons for all my social media at the bottom of the page.
Okay.
I've got journal entries of the first full year of grief connected to my page, as well as multiple other writings in different forms. Um, if you're interested in the coloring book I just mentioned, it's like the third or fourth section down. You'll see it, and the button there will take you directly to the Amazon page for it. Uh, I've got an About Me section. I've got a lot of the media I've been on. I've got grief resources on there. I've got several different things on there to kind of help people out, just kind of in the grief community.
Wonderful. And as always, anybody who's listening, we will make sure those links are in our show notes. So you can pop down there and make sure to grab those links as well to get connected with Jason. Jason, thank you so much for being willing to not only share this recipe that
Mm.
I'm looking forward to trying,
Hmm.
but also for being willing to share your story in such a raw and unfiltered way that I
Mm.
think will have so much value to our listeners who have
Mm.
maybe walking in a
Mm.
similar journey or have experienced similar things.
Mm.
Um, or even those who are listening that maybe are wanting to support someone who's going through that, give them a little bit of insight on maybe what it's like. And so thank you so much. It's such an honor to be able to have you on today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and thank you everyone for listening. And make sure to come back next time. We'll see you then. If you or anyone that you know is struggling with any of the topics that we discussed in today's episode, make sure to check out our show notes for support and resources. You can get help. Thanks again for joining us on today's episode of The Real Family Eats. If you're a parent ready to share your real life parenting story, make sure to reach out to us in our website found in the show notes. And that goes for today's recipe, social medias, support, and resources. All of that can be found in our show notes. So make sure to check them out. And make sure to follow, like, share, subscribe, and stay up to date on all things The Real Family Eats. I hope you'll join us next time for more food for thought and thoughtful food. Enjoy your eats.